Hey, what's up, guys? It's Nick too. My apologies. I'm a little bit tired because I've been absolutely blasting the brand new season. In about 10 hours, by using this build, I was able to get to level 75 by literally just nuking the entire screen constantly. This build is by far and away the absolute best and most efficient build to use when you're just farming the domain tunnels, which is by far the most efficient way to level up right now. The best thing about this build is that you can use this from pretty much level 40 onward without any legendaries or anything, and as you can see, you just absolutely annihilate everything. It's by far the best early game build for Rogue if you're looking to just speed farm as fast as humanly possible. With all the Shadow Imbuement, the constant spam of Death Trap, Shadow Imbuement, you just blow up the entire screen, and you can just clear domain tunnels ridiculously fast. Like I said, this build doesn't really utilize legendaries or anything like that. I had unbelievably terrible gear, and at level 55 I was killing mobs that are level 75 and just completely zooming through. And yeah, I figured I would just upload the build for you guys so you can see exactly how you can set it up very early into the game. Keep in mind that this is an early end game oriented setup, so this is not going to be like a tier 100 nightmare dungeon pushing setup or whatever, but if you're looking to just level up as fast as humanly possible and get yourself into later into the end game, like around level 80 or so, this is definitely the build to do so. All right, before we jump into things, I want to show you guys a fantastic way to stay up to date with a lot of the new meta builds that are coming. With the season coming out, there's a crazy amount of empiric powers that are probably going to shift the meta quite a bit, and there's going to be a lot of builds popping up as a result. So with today's sponsor, Mobalytics, you can actually download their desktop app completely for free, and they're going to be very quickly updating this, so you guys can go in here and not only look at tier lists of builds, but also just discover completely new, different builds that you probably otherwise wouldn't have. And it's extremely easy to follow. You can very easily just go in here and just see, okay, probably Necromancer Minion is most likely going to be an S tier build, and then you could go to builds, sort by Necromancer, and boom, you could even find that build here. So if you're interested in checking out a whole bunch of other builds, Mobalytics on the desktop app, which is for free, has a ton of those, and they even have their own built-in build planner, which is pretty insane. You don't have to go to a different website or anything. It's just right here, and I use this all the time actually to be able to check just when I'm not on a certain character what's in their skill tree or what a certain legendary is. You can just type it in and just to check like what is on the tooltip. Another fantastic thing about Mobalytics is you can also pop it open in-game, so you can very easily just copy a build in-game while opening or like looking at your own skill tree, so you can very easily see, okay, these are all the skills that I want to use, and literally have your own skill tree open right here. Another thing that they recently added, which is extremely helpful, is they actually have an in-game overlay that's going to show event timer. So as you can see, I can pop on the Helltide, and down there you can see that there's the Helltide active for another 53 minutes. And that's really insane. It also showed me like world boss timers when it's pretty close. You can even move it around, edit the overlay settings, do all kinds of stuff. It's pretty cool. Highly recommend checking it out. Again, you can download it completely for free, and it's just a fantastic way to stay up to date with a lot of the new builds. So big thanks to them for sponsoring today's video, and let's get into it. All right, let's just get into it. I'm not going to have my camera on because I am insanely tired right now. But yeah, let's just get into the build. The entirety of it will be posted over on my website if you want to be able to see skill points, etc. Just keep in mind that this is an early endgame build, okay? My gear is pretty bad. You don't need any legendaries for this build to work at all. The primary purpose of this is for speed farming early into the end game up to around level 80. You can definitely take it all the way to level 100 if you want to farm the domain tunnels, or if you even just want to do nightmare dungeons. Just keep in mind that the purpose of this is for speed farming and not for, like, you know, killing Uber Lilith or doing tier 100 nightmare dungeons, right? The purpose is to just absolutely blast the map, and the reason they were able to do that so efficiently and with very little gear at all is because everything is actually just baked into the kit. Basically, we are taking full advantage of Shadow Imbuement paired with Death Trap. What's so insane about Shadow Imbuement is you kill one mob and then they blow up and the entire screen blows up and everything just dies pretty much. So ideally, we are able to spam Shadow Imbuement as much as humanly possible, and we can do this by facilitating Death Trap paired with Preparation. So every time that we pop our Death Trap, by using Preparation, it's going to then reset the cooldown on our Shadow Imbuement. And every 100 energy we spend further reduces the cooldown on our Death Trap. But also, we have Exposure, where anytime we just land a lucky hit while we have Death Trap down, which is going to proc all the time because there's just so many mobs, we're going to be constantly reducing the cooldown of our Death Trap, which means that we can then use it more, so then we can use more and more Shadow Imbuments. Not only does using Death Trap to suck everything in and then pairing it with Shadow Imbuement to just blow up the entire screen just work phenomenally by default, but what is even so much more powerful about this is when you pair it with Consuming Shadows, where anytime you kill an enemy with shadow damage, you generate 30 energy. So you basically instantly go from a useless character that doesn't have any energy generation, that can't even like press Twisting Blades very often, to a character that can spam Shadow Imbuement constantly, spam Death Trap constantly, and have nearly infinite energy with, like I said, literally 0 legendaries or anything, and just absolutely blast through the entire map. To further round out the build, we're using Puncture, which doesn't really matter. You could use any basic skill or even no basic skill if you really wanted to. Blade Shift is pretty good so that you can just get extra movement speed. Twisting Blades, obviously, because it's the best core skill for this. And Dash is just for mobility, and Shadow Step is just for the Unstoppable. If you wanted to, you could actually add in Poison Imbuement or even add in Poison Trap instead of Shadow Step, but it just really is not necessary at this point. Later into the game, we are definitely going to swap into Poison Imbuement and have a build focused on poison damage because it is so unbelievably strong. But early on into the game, when you're leveling, you do more than enough damage, and poison really needs a lot of like legendaries and glyphs and all this other stuff to really get going, but this build just works right out the rip. So let's just get into the skill points. I'll talk about some legendaries and some vampiric powers, and that will pretty much be it. You guys can just be on your way. Like I said, I literally swapped to this at like level 40. Like, you can swap to this without anything, and you just absolutely own. So, Puncture with Fundamental just for some vulnerable application. Twisting Blades with the cooldown reduction is really nice, paired with just reducing the cooldown of our Death Trap even more. Sturdy for some damage reduction. Shadow Step into the crit chance and the stun, just for a guaranteed stun on like tanky elites. Weapon Mastery for extra damage, and then you can put 1 point into Dash, just take it out of the stun if you wanted to, or even take it out of Agile. Agile is just a bit of extra defense, but you don't entirely need it. I have Agility skill on like my Amulet or something in my boots, I think. It's not really a good thing to have, I just don't have to put the point into Dash. Weapon Mastery for damage, Exploit for damage, Malice for damage, Agile for, like I said, just a chance to dodge, but it's not really all that good. I put 5 points into Shadow Imbuement just because I had extra points left over. If you end up getting Penance to Greaves early, you would take 3 points out of Shadow Imbuement and put it into Frigid Finesse. 1 into Shadow Crash and 3 into Consuming Shadows for the unbelievably insane energy generation. 3 into Precision Imbuement just for the chance to crit, which is still good because crit chance or crit damage does still have a 50% damage multiplier associated, so it is still good to crit. 3 into Innervation. Honestly, this really isn't necessary, but I just like the more energy, the merrier for me. But if you wanted to, you could take that out and put it into some other stuff like, Dash or even Siphoning Strikes for more healing, Stutter Step for more movement speed, yada yada. Trap Mastery is really good for just 12% crit chance after you use your Death Trap. And then we're going to put points into Death Trap and reduce the cooldown by 12 seconds if it kills an enemy, which it pretty much always will. 2 points into Aftermath, which you could even put a 3rd point into. Anytime you just use Death Trap, you'll just get full energy. This is just nice to make sure that you can always be spamming. It's a little bit redundant because if Death Trap kills an enemy, which it pretty much will, you'll get 30 energy anyway per enemy. So you're just swimming in energy, right? So you don't really need this, but I had extra points and found it to be pretty helpful. And then 1 into Adrenaline Rush and 3 into Haste for movement speed as well as some attack speed. And then we use Exposure. Later on into the game, close quarters combat is unbelievably broken. I don't want you to think that this is the best overall build, but very early into the game, you don't get a ton of damage versus crowd controlled. As you can see, I don't even have that much right now, and close quarters combat gives me a 50% multiplicative damage increase, which is just unbelievably insane. But if your goal is to just speed farm like an absolute psychopath, Exposure is unbelievably busted because you just get so much cooldown reduction for your Death Trap to where you can just spam it over and over again, and every time you use a Death Trap, you get your Shadow Imbuement back, and it also pulls everything in and also just nukes the whole screen, right? So Exposure is unbelievably ridiculous for this. When it comes to your gear, my gear is pretty scuffed, and like I said, you don't really need any legendaries at all for this to work. The only legendary that I would say is, I guess, mandatory would be Blade Dancers, which you can literally unlock at level 15. It's very expensive to imprint on a two-hander. I would not recommend doing that. Just imprint on like an amulet or something. And as you can see, even at level 75, I don't have very many legendaries. I have like an old Blade Dancer's ring that I've been using for, I don't know, since level 60 or something. I just put Edge Masters on 2 levels ago. I imprinted this, which I actually would recommend you guys. You guys can get this from the Codex. It's a seasonal thing where whenever you spend 100 energy, you release a cluster of exploding stun grenades that just stuns enemies. It actually is pretty nice for just stunning enemies every once in a while, just so you have more uptime on stun, and it procs fairly frequently. It also increases the damage that Exposure does. It's not really great, but it is a legendary. Outside of that, the only other legendaries that I'd really focus on getting early on, going out of your way to imprint with, would be Disobedience for survivability and Aspect of Might for even more survivability. And some other honorable mentions for survivability would also be Cheats Aspect. But Cheats Whereas the cheats isn't really all that good until you start to get Penitent Greaves, because otherwise, without Penitent Greaves, you're not applying crowd control too much. The only way that we are currently applying crowd control is with stun via exposure and with this legendary that I mentioned. But if the enemies are stunned, obviously they're not really going to be hitting back, in which case cheats wouldn't really be helping you. Some other aspects you should be on the lookout for that are pretty good is Aspect of Corruption to just increase the damage of your Shadow Imbuement. Edgemaster's aspect is just good for overall extra damage. Ravenous aspect is pretty insane for energy generation, as well as aspect of the Umbral, but honestly, you just have so much energy, it like really isn't necessary. Any sort of movement speed thing is going to be pretty good for you. Also, I would look out for accelerating aspect, which just drastically increases your attack speed. When it comes to stats on gear, I'm not going to go too in-depth with this. It'll be posted over on the website, and I'll update it over time. The main thing is that you want to get a little bit of additional armor so that you have around 90% armor here, but when you get Disobedience stacked up, you'll be more than armor capped for enemies that are significantly higher level than you. But if you're not fighting mobs that are too much higher than you, then you only need around where it says 90 to 100% physical damage reduction. Outside of that, I'd recommend getting a helmet that has all resistance on it. You can get a helmet that has fire, shadow, lightning, poison. That would be unbelievably insane. And try to just gem into a little bit of resistance, maybe of whichever one that you're missing. And if you just have that covered, as well as some max HP, some straight up damage reduction rolls on chest and pants, it'll be literally impossible to die, okay? They made it insanely easy to just gear up and not really have to worry about the damage that you're taking, as long as you just actually build into a little bit of damage reduction and you get all your resistances covered, as well as having a couple defensive legendaries. Outside of that, for your gloves, I'd recommend getting crit chance, attack speed, and then ranks 2 twisting blades. For your boots, I'd recommend getting movement speed, energy cost reduction, some form of resistance if you can. On your weapons, I'd recommend getting vulnerable damage if you have the exploit glyph, core skill damage, damage to close range enemies, damage to crowd controlled. Crit damage is not nearly as good as it used to be because it is not multiplicative anymore. Neither is vulnerable damage, but vulnerable damage is still good because it's very high uptime. I'd also recommend getting dexterity. Dexterity is the single best stat that you can get. Sorry, I'm like tired, but I'm like kind of amped up, so it's a little bit weird. Sorry if I'm going through things pretty quickly, but it'll be posted over on the site, right? Mainly just look out for core skill damage, damage to close, dexterity, and vulnerable damage, and then damage to crowd controlled. On your rings, I'd recommend looking for the exact same stuff, but try to get crit chance. And then on the amulet, there's a lot of stuff that you can get. You can get survivability, you can get movement speed, you can get like damage reduction, armor, and then some ranked stuff to look out for that's pretty good is you can get ranks to exploit, ranks to malice, or ranks to weapon mastery, all of which are pretty good. When it comes to vampiric powers, I will show you guys the ones that I've been using pretty much the entire time, and I wouldn't really recommend swapping off of these all that much. Resilience and Undying by themselves like quadruple your survivability. It's insane. Undying just heals you all the time because you're spamming Twisting Blades and Shadow Imbuement and Death Trap and Dash so much that you just heal ridiculous with this. Resilience is also insane for just a ton of additional damage reduction, and both of these are very low cost. For increasing your damage by a lot, Ravenous is very good. It basically just gives you attack speed by up to 40% of your total movement speed. Currently, as you can see, this gives me 47% attack speed just from me standing here because I have movement speed on my amulet and on my boots. But if I were to fully upgrade these, as well as getting the movement speed from haste, as well as stutter step, and if I had this absolutely maxed out, I could be getting an 80% attack speed bonus just from one vampiric power. So that is going to massively increase your damage output. Outside of that, I've been using Sanguine Brace just for a little bit of damage reduction that the Fortify does give you, but this is probably the one that I'd soonest take off. Anticipation is fantastic because it reduces the cooldown of Death Trap by an entire 20%. I haven't even checked if it works, but I'm pretty sure that it works. Yeah, it works. So Death Trap, you just have to be out of the town. So Death Trap goes from a 50-second cooldown to a 40-second cooldown just by using that. That is really, really strong for us as well. Some other vampiric powers to look out for. Prey on the Weak is good for just straight up additional damage to vulnerable enemies. And none of the other ones are really all that good. If you play with Poison, Flowing Veins ends up being really good. And one that I'm waiting to unlock, which I believe is the last one that you get from the seasonal journey, which is taking forever, is Metamorphosis. So anytime you evade, you just get unstoppable. I would probably replace Sanguine Brace with that and literally keep every single one of these other ones because they are just so unbelievably powerful for survivability, and Ravenous is just busted for damage. If you wanted even more damage, Moonrise would give you 20% attack speed as well as some movement speed. And I wouldn't bother leveling it up because that just increases the basic skill damage. So if you wanted even more damage, you could get rid of, I don't know, Resilience or something if you wanted to. But I think it's definitely worth to keep these. The Paragon board will be posted over on the website. I wouldn't worry too much about it because this is a very early leveling build, and if you're just farming in the Domhain tunnels, you're not going to have glyphs really. These are just glyphs that I managed to get. I'll quickly go over what I did. In the first board, I just went for Closer, literally just for the damage reduction. Second board, I just grabbed some core skill damage, which is pretty good early on because you don't have much additive damage to start out with. And then I slammed an Exploit because in this board, Cunning Stratagem, you have enough strength to get Exploit unlocked. The only other board that you can do this with before getting Exploit level 15 and having the extra radius, the only other board would be No Witness. Exploit is still good because you still get 20% multiplicative damage from Vulnerable. Sorry, I had an aneurysm there, but you also get an extra 9% from Malice. So you do get 29% multiplicative damage, and you basically can have Vulnerable up all the time. So if you happen to get Vulnerable damage rolled on your gear, it is still a good stat to have, even though it's not multiplicative anymore. Next to that, I went and got the Cheap Shot board, because with Death Trap and the Exposure Key passive, you are constantly crowd controlling enemies in the form of stunning them, especially with the Cluster Grenade legendary. So you do get a ton of extra value from all of this damage crowd controlled, and the damage reduction from elites down here is particularly nice. And this is also a very good glyph slot here. Ideally, I would actually have Control Glyph in here, but right now I just have Turf for the damage reduction. But ideally, you can get Control and then level it up and then get a whole bunch of Int, and that ends up being very good. And then you get a lot of damage to crowd controlled. At some point, you end up swapping to Close Quarters Combat, like I said, and then you stop playing with this exact setup. And that is why this board is so good, because there's so much damage crowd control that all turns into a multiplicative bonus. And I'm at level 75 right now, and this is all that I have. So by the time that you're like level 75 to 80, I will just have a different build video posted for doing higher Nightmare dungeons and pushing. But otherwise, if you're just doing the Domhain tunnels, you can just put your points wherever you want. Just go for another board that just has some random damage stuff, and you'll be perfectly fine. That's pretty much it for the build. I didn't want to go like super in depth with you guys because it will be posted over on the website, and this is an early endgame build, right? You don't need 5,000 legendaries for this to work. You can literally put on Blade Dancer's aspect and then go, and that's pretty much what I did. I think at level 44 or something, I codexed Disobedience as well as Aspect of Might. I had Blade Dancer's aspect codexed on my amulet, and I was using a level 20 amulet all the way up until like level 70. And that's all that I had on my character. I didn't have any other legendaries, and as you can see, these other legendaries really aren't impacting my damage all that much at all. Like 17% every once in a while from Edge Masters. Now I'll just show you guys some gameplay of doing Domhain tunnels, because this is the best way to level up. In case you want to know, the dungeon is right here above Saragar. This is by far the best way to level until you're like level 80, if not higher than that. I'm going to swap and start doing Nightmare Dungeons, and I'll probably swap to a more Nightmare Dungeon-oriented build. This build can very easily clear Nightmare Dungeons. Like, it's more than capable of doing that, and I'm going to play with this for a bit. But in Nightmare Dungeons, you're going to want a little bit more boss damage, so I think I'm going to add Poison Imbuement to the build, which is something that you guys can experiment with as well. But I need a bit more gear to really fully build into Poison Imbuement and for it to actually be good. And until you have a lot of gear, like, this is what you want to be doing. But you could get all the way to level 100 just farming this one dungeon. Like, it's pretty insane. But I've been farming open world using this setup, farming like the new vampire area. I forget what it's called, but basically Vampire Helltide. I've been farming that with this build, with like being like 10, 15 levels under, and it's been perfectly fine. So I'll just show you guys how to play with the build. And like I said, the main thing is that you want to pop Shadow Imbuement first, and then Death Trap, and then you can Shadow Imbuement again, and as you can see, because Shadow Imbuement blows everything up, you just get a bunch of lucky hits to where you just get your Death Trap back instantly. When the mobs have more HP, you proc Exposure more, so you get more and more Death Traps, like when the mobs are tankier. At this point, I actually do a little bit too much damage to where I don't get a ton of Death Trap like resets. Like if you look at the gameplay at the start of the video when I was under leveled, I would get Death Trap resets more because I proc more lucky hits, like it takes more hits for the enemies to die. And at this point, I just do so much damage because the build is just a little bit more fleshed out, and I just have my gear upgrade and stuff. that my death trap doesn't reset as quickly as it otherwise would. But when there's like a ton of mobs, or when they're higher level than you by like 5-10 levels, your death trap just resets over and over and over again. But I mean, even if it's not instantaneously resetting, right? It's still a pretty low cooldown, and just by spamming Twisting Blades, you get the cooldown reduction because of preparation there. So yeah, you can just blast with the build, fly around, everything just blows up. Shadow Beam is by far my favorite skill, and Death Trap is probably my second favorite. So being able to use them so synergistically together for just an absolute psychopathic speed farming build is a ton of fun. Yeah, that's pretty much it for the video. Hopefully you guys found it helpful, and I will see you guys later. Peace.